Okay, so moving on to the importance of why we need to be at cloud base, and the reason we have to get to cloud base, the reason that we need to find the strongest part of the thermal at every point. Let's draw an imaginary line of 1500 meters. This is just an imaginary line, it can be any height. We have the ground. We have a cloud. Now, harking back to our latent heat of water of 540 off the top of my head calories per gram, 1 cubic centimeter cubed. Remember, we have absorbed that to evaporate water and not change temperature. As the thermic funnel comes up, when we reach the dew point, this water vapor will condense into water and make a cloud. Here's where we get the latent heat release. When we go from water vapor to water, we drop the 540 calories of heat. It suddenly goes into the air. This heat heats the air. Hotter air goes up. When it goes up, there's a gap. It then sucks air to fill that gap. And that is what is called cloud suck, when the water vapor condenses into water, loses the latent heat, warms that air, which then goes up again and sucks. Now, if at mid-levels, from 1500 to 3500 meters, if that is humid air with great humidity and it sucks that air, it then condenses again, drops another 540 and goes up. It then sucks again and starts what's called a heat engine. And that is how these clouds build. Now, if we reach this dew point or cloud base of what we talk with the condensation of water and the dropping of the heat, it then warms the area and we will get what's called general lift. And if we can get to that level, let's call it in this example, if this is 2700 meters, let's call this level 2200 meters with cloud suck. If we can get above this level, then we will be in general lift and stay in that general lift, cloud by cloud. So this is a critical level to obtain, because instead of just relying on a thermal, we then rely on general lift. Now, just because you can see a cloud, we know for certain that there is condensation of water, there is a dropping of latent heat. Just because you can't see a cloud does not mean that we have condensation of water. If we have condensation of water and there's not enough in that concentrated place to be able to see it as a cloud, we still have that heat released and general lift. So you can fly a blue sky day where we have the condensation of water, but there's not enough to make the clouds thick enough, and you can fly a blue sky day above this or near this condensation level point and stay in the air with general light lift. And that's the importance using the latent heat, and that's the importance of understanding water vapor and the transitions between to get to this level. And this is how we fly exceeds much easier than just catching thermals. If we just catch a thermal up to here, we don't have this, we will glide like that, and we must find another thermal. So if we get to a lower level, we are always desperately trying to find another thermal. If we get to this level, it might be 1500, let's call it 22. If we get to this level, we catch a thermal up. I will use a different coloured pen. We catch our thermal up. When we go on glide, we stay at this level rather than this level. If we lose this for some reason, we then fall into this area, and our objective at all times is to get back there so we can continue the flight. So part of getting high is staying high is two parts. Number one, if we get to this condensation level, we fly the clouds. We fly the condensation level. If we get below it, we must search out a thermal to not get us to there, but to get us back to that point every time. If we don't stay there, we can, or unless we're very good, we can manage to stay up, but it will be a difficult, hard flight below those levels. So, getting to cloud base, number one, we have this. Remember, +5, +4, +3, +2, +1. We have a huge section, +0.5. This +5 level will get to cloud base. +4 might take us to that condensation level. +3 is just below it. +2 is here. +1 is there. +0.5 there. So, from a time issue as well, 3,000 meter climb. If we're in 0.5 meters per second, it will take us 1.45 hours. If we're in 5 meters per second, it will take us 10 minutes. So these are the reasons a time issue with climbing in a thermal to find the strongest point, which will have the most likely ability to reach your cloud base point. The lesser the lift you in, it will simply not make it. Now that's not saying every day is 5, your thermal might max at 2, 1, 0.5, etc. Then you can catch the 2 to cloud base because that's the lapse rate for that day that's giving you point to cloud base. But if you work your thermals and you find that 2 is not the strongest point, but 5 is, you need to work the 5 to get there. If the max you can find is 2s, then 2's all you need to find to get there, and that will generally repeat through the day. So after you check your first couple of thermals, you'll work out that 2 is all that's there. That's getting to cloud base. When we find another thermal, we just get into the 2 and off we go. We'll reach cloud base. We don't need to keep searching for the 5 or stuff like that, and that creates efficiently. If we found our 5, then we need to work on 5s at every point to get to cloud base to keep flying. So with our first thermal or 2 as an exploratory thermal to work out what's happening for the day, then after that we can fly efficiently because we don't need to keep searching for something we know is not there. Now the important thing also about cloud base is because it gets hotter, then our relative humidity will decrease through the day and cloud base will get higher to reach the dew point. So we've got to take into account each 30 minutes that we fly, so we'll be gradually getting higher and higher. Of course this doesn't happen every day, but you'll be able to work it out when you're flying in thermals and you're structuring your flight. That's why we're efficient, because when we work out cloud base is say 2700, as soon as we get close to 2700, we don't spend 10 minutes trying to get another 100 meters. We've already left at that point to fly because we know where it is. An hour later we might go, oh, I easily get to 2800 or 2850. Now it doesn't necessarily progress in a linear fashion. It can be 27, 28 for 2 hours, then suddenly bump to 3000. But we have that progression through the day, and as the day progresses later on, that cloud base can drop later on, or the thermals don't quite get there, or the thermals can change back to, instead of 5 meter thermals, there'll be 3 meter thermals, and they can possibly still make it. So we need a bit of this math and exploration when we begin flying to make it more efficient. Now you don't need to do any of this. It'll just be that each thermal will be like your first thermal of the day, and so you'll be reinventing the wheel each time. That's what makes us efficient and a little bit quicker than others with less stress, because we don't search for what's not there. So this is our ultimate goal at every point. Now let's have a look at some of the thermic structures. And these are some other important things when flying. We have our classical diagram of the thermal wind direction this way. Remember, this is an adiabatic parcel. It doesn't share energy or matter. The wind goes around it. goes around the structure. There will be mixing at the weakest point. You want to be inside this structure, not on the edge, catching it. Now, if we do not know anything and we enter our thermal, remember it's about a 1 in 20 size, here's our little paragliding guy. If we enter a thermal and we get chopped up, if we want to find the strongest point, if this is the wind direction, we can see the strongest point gets blown least by the wind, the lesser stuff gets blown more, so the thermal structures get elongated. Remember, it's not just a thermal, it's a thermic structure. If I turn with the wind, remember the wind is going that direction, if my first turn is with the wind and I get lost in here, I will shoot back and it will be difficult to find the thermal. The most important turn is, if in doubt, or at any point, every single turn should be into the wind, because that is the most likely point of finding the strongest part of the thermal, just from a probability. If I'm flying crosswind and I hit a bump pushing me to the right, obviously we know the thermic structure is on the left, I turn again into the wind. The only time that I wouldn't need to turn into the wind is if I'm flying tail and I run into the very centre of the thermal. If I'm going tail and I get tilted to one side, again my first turn is into the wind, eventually, when I'm flying tail. So we can see flying tail, which we'll generally be doing with an XC, is we can hit, or we will hit, very abrupt climbs, and if we run into the middle of a thermal, our climb will be abrupt, we must turn quickly. If we're flying into the wind, then we will have to travel for quite a distance, and this distance can be from 10 to 30 seconds at times to get into the middle of the thermal. We can of course start turning quickly, but if we're going into the wind, one can see that one will easily be drifted out, especially with this tailwinds getting caught up, it will push you out. When we're going into the wind, we must fly for a longer period to actually get into our thermal structure at some point. So we can see these differences. Going tail with the cross country, we're going to have abrupt hits onto a thermal. Unless we come to the side, get lifted away, then we turn back in. If we get any kind of lift, as we can see, a little do-do-do-do, there's probably a thermal there. You have to fly very carefully so you can feel the bump to one side. If you have a vario and you listen to the vario because it is very loud, you'll be concentrating on that rather than the bump of air to tell you which side the thermal is on and which side to turn. So I advise to turn your vario down so it doesn't actually fill up your whole mind all the time and take you away from feeling what the air is doing, so you can make the correct decision on the correct turn to find that thermal structure in the air. Next. Now, when I say don't use a vario, I'm not saying don't use a vario. What I'm saying is turn your sound down so it's just loud enough so you can hear it, possibly only when you concentrate on it. Make sure you always have a visual so you can always cross-check what is actually occurring, because if you're in sync and you go to less sync, it actually feels as though you're in lift. So you need the vario to cross-check that. If you're in very light lift and you're in the middle of between the clouds and the ground, you don't have a reference system, so you won't know whether you're going up or down. Near the ground, you don't need that because obviously you can see the ground and you're going up, and near the clouds you can reference yourself according to the clouds. Now, let's have a look at a thermal. Here is our wind direction. Make that arrow better. Just draw a thing like that. I'm going through different bits and pieces for everyone. The thermal structure will slope in the wind and you will drift. We have a single wind direction there. A lot of people go, I found some sink and I remained in sink and I couldn't get out of the sink. Sink was everywhere. Sink is not everywhere. just like a thermal isn't everywhere. People seem to have difficulties finding thermals, but they manage to not have a problem finding sync. They fall out of thermals, but they seem to remain in sync. Why is that so? The reason is very simple. Sync is an adiabatic particle, just like the thermal, and it will move exactly like the thermal, except down in the opposite direction because it is too dense and it's trying to find the appropriate density in the atmosphere, just like the thermal is trying to find the density. So the sync will also drift with the wind. Now, this is sync. Sync. Thermal. When we leave the thermal and go on glide, we get some sync. And if we go on glide with the tailwind behind us, we will remain in that sync to the ground in several minutes. What we must do, because the sync is following the direction of the wind, just like the thermal followed the direction of the wind, as we leave that thermal, is a good idea if one continues to want to make distance to move at 45-degree forwards over 100 to 200 meters, possibly more, depending on the size of your thermal structure, to avoid the possibility of sync. If you are going tailwind and you are in sync, you will not be able to get out of your sync. You may possibly get out of it if you put on speed bar and get some more acceleration. That is one of the methods used, and that is like the method of when you get into a thermic structure, count to 3, then turn. That method works really well when you know absolutely nothing and is the best shot at a median in the probability distribution of things to do. This is another thing. If you don't understand what to do, put on your speed bar and try to speed out of it. Another method is to understand what's occurring, realize that the sync will move with the direction of the wind, so you have to move at a direction that is not tailwind or in that direction, so you can move away from that sync, and that's why people think sync is everywhere. So moving on to some other examples of thermic structures and sync structures. As per yesterday, up top we have a southerly wind. Down here we may have a northerly. Here we may have a southwest. The thermal structure, or let's put southwest there. The thermic structure drifts there, will change direction there, and change direction there. It will move in the air. It's not just this one continuous movement. If you have winds which are consistent along all the different verticals, then you'll have much easier thermals because you'll drift at a common rate. That is often rare. So we have to be aware as we thermal up in the structure that when we get more lift, it could be a wind direction change going through a shear level. If we reach turbulence, because we will have a shear level through a couple of different things, number one, wind speed and also wind direction, that the thermal will get bumpy moving through those shear levels. That is not a reason to be scared of the thermal or trying to leave it. It is an indication that you have to more strongly stay within it to get through your very common shear levels and not fear them. What people do is, as it gets a bit rough, they leave it at the very point that they need to get tighter and more concentrated. There can be several shear levels. We can see here there will be a certain lift. It might be it might be 2 meters per second. This point here might jump to 4 meters per second. This might go down to 2.5 meters per second. Just because you change speeds does not mean that you're falling out of the thermal at every point. So this is very, very common. I'm going to show you another section of a thermal. I call it helix myself. People can call it anything they please. I have what's called a single helix, a double helix, and a triple helix. There's probably more, but let's leave it at that. This is my invention, so don't look for it in the textbooks. We have a section of thermal moving up. Let's just put a curve on it. This is just a representation, so don't look for it in the books or try to prove otherwise. Let's call this the +5 curve. Now, just because we have a thermic structure and we call that thermic structure an adiabatic parcel, in fact, if we get a little bit more complex as we get higher level here, the +5 part of the thermal can actually separate itself as a different adiabatic parcel from your +4 meter section. So the 4 meter section can wind in and out of our 5 meter section. And so this is when these thermals get quite rough, because you may be thermaling across two separate adiabatic pieces of air. As another complexity we may have if this pen works, another section which has separated itself adiabatically to move at +3. We can see that even though we look at a structure with the different sections, they will often separate themselves as separate adiabatic parcels and move separately. This will create, if they're small sections, a pretty rough thermal. Now, a lot of people go, this thermal's rough or it's not consistent. We can see here there will be something through there. We can see gaps in this. There's a gap, there's a gap, there's a gap, there's a gap. That we will be in lift, will be out of lift. It will appear to be inconsistent when in fact we should remain in that and be happy with +4s, +3s, gaps and +5s. So we should not be unhappy or look necessarily for perfect lift, just going up in a single thing. We will only find that 1 in 20 times or 1 in 20 days. So we must be happy that the lift is inconsistent. If we carefully map this and listen for the different aspects of the thermal, we can actually identify in the air whether it's 2-headed, 3-headed, 4-headed, 1-headed, or otherwise. Now, remember, peoples, this will also work for sync. So we have to be careful as we get more complex with our ability to judge what's happening, what is happening with our sync, and to fly out of it or find the least point of sync to remain in if you so desire to get to the ground for various reasons. Another technique is getting to the ground, not just getting up. So after you've learned all these things I've taught you, your problem now will be getting down. That will be a further lecture, how to get down. Let us move forwards. More complex techniques, of course. What we'll do is we'll create our mountain again. These techniques work. Make sure that you always have a landing field or paddock that is adequately sized, which is not dangerous at all times. Number one thing, must always have a landing field. We create a thermic bubble. This thermic bubble is not high enough to lift off. It wants to get up the mountain or up here. Here is the top of the mountain. Now, let's say this thermic bubble is 100 meters high. I'll make it high enough for you to thermal in. The air remains in that thermic bubble. The wind is going around. That thermic bubble, when it moves, is probably moving at walking pace, maybe slightly faster, maybe running pace, 10 kilometers an hour. But what you will feel is this part of the wind remaining in the thermic bubble combined with its speed will combine to often give you what you feel like as the 30 kilometer hour wind. The bubble is not moving at 30 kilometers an hour, it's moving at walking pace or jogging pace. When you're within the thermic bubble, the air is not a wind, but it will feel to you as though it is a wind. It is very separate from a predominant wind. Because this air is moving up here, then we can find this thermal and start lightly thermaling in it, very, very carefully. And we're remaining just at the top of a thermic bubble. Now this thermic bubble doesn't have enough strength to lift off, but it can, through breaking of the surface tension, move progressively up the hill. Now it will try to reach the highest point, so we can remain thermaling at the top of that bubble as it proceeds up the hill. It may lift off there, and then we can go with it. The important aspect of this is to always have a landing paddock as one tracks very low to the ground. One must thermal very carefully. This is one of the times that you may use a counter body shift to keep your turns light and consistent. It is important to not get aggravated, but to understand that one's at the top of a thermic bubble and following it as it proceeds to go up a slope towards a higher point. But if there's not a higher point, there is nothing for it to eventually reach. If there's no mountain starting here, the thermal will only get to here and you'll be stuck at this point and you will need a landing point. But let's say we have a mountain for it to climb. The important thing is that thermal could move here, then suddenly get hot enough and lift off. If it doesn't, you must keep following it, could lift off there. If not, you keep following it, could lift off there. Again, repeating, it may not lift off until it gets to there. It may not lift off at all because it has reached its equivalent potential temperature at the top of the mountain because it wasn't strong enough in the first place to lift straight off to get to cloud base, and so it just wanted to get here. But at least you will return to a higher point. This is a more sophisticated way of catching thermals. Let's have a look at inversion levels. What is an inversion? An inversion is where the lapse rate either decreases or approaches zero or completely reverses. So as you rise in the air, the actual temperature goes up. Now, just a couple of points about inversions. There is something called a ground inversion, which exists every day. That does not mean that the inversion is on the ground. What it means is that the ground, which is the heating source, and, mind you, the cooling source, is sucking up all the energy out of the gases above it. The ground will always either give energy to gases or suck energy out of gases because of the density of the ground relative to gases, which is approximately 1,000 times. Gases will not, with our general pressures here on Earth, heat the ground. There is too much density. It would take 1,000 meters of gases with the same temperature to touch that ground to be able to change its temperature, but it can't because as we go up 1,000 meters with the dry adiabatic lapse rate, we'll lose 10 degrees anyway. So therefore the gases cannot possibly hit the ground with that 1,000 times density difference, no matter how one tries to spin it. Okay, so we have our ground here, and each day we are going to get a ground inversion. Now, what is the importance of inversions? Our lapse rate will normally go up like this as a theoretical number. Now, a ground inversion, if the air is cooled, will look like that. So each morning at approximately 6 a.m, our sounding will have a ground inversion where the temperature is coolest on the ground and rises up. This ground inversion could get to 200 meters, it could get to 1,500 meters. Let's just call it that range. It can be high, it can be low, but let's call it that. So with this ground inversion, the air temperature is increasing. In this valley here, when we have the river down the bottom, we actually have much cooler air down near the river because we have katabatic winds which flow down from the mountain. they go underneath the warmer air and then they start filling up the lowest part of the valley like a pool of cool air. The closer you are to the river, the colder you will be at night, the warmer you'll be as you track up the mountain. We could expect to see on every single day warmer temperatures as we move up. People with their houses should build them, as they often do, on little spurs and little rises to get away from that cool air, as this house is built on a little rise. So that is an inversion there. It will happen every day, should happen pretty much around the entire world at every point, a ground inversion. That ground inversion could be just a few meters as well. Now, as the day progresses, that ground inversion will be eaten away like this as the ground temperature rises and the gases above it get hotter, until we reach what's called a trigger point, which can be any temperature from 10 degrees to 40 degrees, where we can get the thermic structures going up. Now, higher in the air, often caused by high pressure systems, we can get inversions where we have air from a high pressure system which is descending and heating. Any air which descends will heat in contrast to air which ascends at the dry adiabatic lapse rate. Now, if we have an inversion there, thermals that are going up as they cool will find it difficult to penetrate. Let's draw an inversion level here. So what happens is the thermals will come up. They cannot get through the inversion, so they will start tracking to the side. What happens is we start getting a turbulent layer. So as one flies, let's call the top of the mountain there. So we don't get confused, this could be at 1400 meters. If we have an inversion level and we catch a thermal up to it, we will get caught in all this mess and it will get turbulent. Now, as the day heats, more and more thermals come up to, say, this inversion level, and eventually, if there's enough thermic activity and there's enough heat, there's enough thermals trying to break through here, and eventually we don't have a ground inversion anymore as the thermals go through this atmosphere. From that point, this breaks, and then we can ascend to higher levels. Now, the ground inversion or the inversion layer doesn't need to break. What happens is if we have a strong enough thermal, that thermal can break through that area. One will have to stay tight within it and it will be extraordinarily turbulent. Now, the main inversion level that keeps all the weather in the troposphere and stops the majority of it getting into the stratosphere is called the tropopause, which is at approximate height of 15,000 meters plus or minus 5,000 meters. The tropopause is an inversion level in the tropics at 30 kilometers where the weather cannot get through, and so contains all the water vapor and everything else in the troposphere and the edge of the tropopause not getting into the stratosphere. So these are how we have to work for inversion levels. We will generally get inversion level every day, especially the ground inversion. That will stop our thermals rising to our dew point quite often. What we can have, if we have an inversion level, we may get a dew point below that inversion level. Our clouds then will spread out and we'll get large pockets of what's called stratocumulus clouds. Stratocumulus are the most common clouds in the atmosphere, and they're a very elongated cloud which does not have vertical height because there is an inversion level above it. Great for catching up because you know that inversion level is above there and your cloud base is there, so you can travel underneath it all day. Now back to what we looked at before with thermic bubbles and thermic tunnels. Let's say we have a bubble of air, an adiabatic bubble increases its temperature by 2 degrees. That bubble can lift straight off. It will rise as a bubble. Your paraglider can be in it, like thus. If that bubble's rising and you chase underneath it and the bubble is at that point, you can miss the bubble and you will not catch the thermal. That is different to a thermal, which is continuous. We have someone turning in it and we can go beneath them and catch that bubble. This bubble can also be, that is a tunnel, continuous flow. This is another bubble, we have a paraglider. At the top we can also enter that here and turn in it. A person coming in lower will miss it. Another reason that we must at all times assertively and aggressively go towards thermic lift that we see immediately. Every single turn that loses you height can make you miss these thermic bubbles. A tunnel does not matter, thermic bubbles do, and especially early in the morning and late, you have to aggressively and assertively work to immediately go towards lift, otherwise you can miss it. What we're simply doing is giving ourselves the greatest probability of catching a lift that then therefore becomes obvious. Now, the most likely place that our tunnels come from is a large thermic pocket of air which has too much distance and too much drag to lift. There's a surface tension broken, so that large pocket of air is fueling that tunnel of air. As shown previously, we could have lots of different thermals coming from that pool of air. House thermals often sitting there because they're continuously flowing for pools of air that are sitting below the mountain, creating that. Getting on to basic triggers and thermal generators. To generate a parcel of air, we need a heating source which will raise temperatures greater than temperatures beside. We need low wind so that the thermals are not belted to pieces. If we have high wind, the turbulence will destroy that parcel. We need shielding on each side, trees, small paddocks, such matters, which are not necessarily too slopey, to allow that thermic bubble to increase in size and temperature and remain trapped. There's a common thermal generator trigger down the road, which is called the chicken sheds. People believe that because the chicken sheds are made from galvanized iron, therefore you have a good thermal generator and galvanized iron works. They are right, and they are also deathly warm. The reason the chicken sheds work so well is because we have chicken sheds, we have trees, best way I can do it, we have other sheds there, and so we have a section of air that can be heated from the ground, from the sides of the sheds, is protected from the wind, and so the area within the sheds and the compound, which is surrounded by a windbreak, allows that air to be heated from 3 different directions and then go up. So the critical thing is near buildings and houses where we have trees and gardens and sections will often be a protected area and a temperature differential for the thermals to generate. Also there will be windbreaks to help that, and as well people generally build their houses in rural areas on uplifted ground rather than in sunken ground, which can draw the rain. From a trigger point of view, we can have an area that is both a generator, we can have an area that is a trigger, and we can have an area that is both a generator and trigger. There's various reasons for this. For example, we can have a raised section of land, we can have a house on top, we can have trees protecting it, and so it will love to develop a thermic bubble. Because we have slopes on each side, mesothermals will love to move up the slope. As well, we have therefore a generator, we have a trigger, and as well, with the temperature differential around here, hotter air will jump over colder air when it is pushed against it. So when we are looking for such things as raised areas and different surroundings, we can safely say there will be both triggers and generators, giving us two possibilities of having the greatest possibility of finding a thermal. If we search for just a trigger without these things, we literally decrease our chances by 50%. If we combine those things, guaranteed at the peak of the day, you will find a thermal there at some point within a time period every single time. Now, to everyone who believes they know how a wing flies, and it doesn't seem to quite add up how we get lift, what we'll do is have a look at what is known over the last 100 years. This is some of the work done by the NACA, which became the NASA, which is NASA. Let's say we take a wind profile, and the wind direction is thus. What actually happens is something like this. How do we create lift, and why do we create lift? Let's say we go back to what's called our buoyancy rules in physics in fluids. If we take an H2 balloon, that balloon is buoyant in the air, which means it wants to go up. It goes up because the parcel is lighter. H2 balloon buoyant. Helium balloon is buoyant. Water vapor is buoyant, and we note that will also go up if we have pure water vapor. So any parcel of gas which is lighter than the general atmosphere will go up. If we put a basketball into a pool and push it down, it will aggressively accelerate up. All lifting gases, a lifting gas is a gas which is lighter than the general atmosphere, will accelerate up. It must accelerate up because gravity is an acceleration down, and to counter gravity, we must have an acceleration because it is an acceleration. If we travel upwards at only a velocity, we will reach a point where we only obtain a parabola and return back to Earth. To obtain orbit around the Earth, our spacecraft must continuously accelerate at greater than 10 meters per second without fail to get into orbit. If at any point they reach a constant velocity, even if it's 30,000 kilometers an hour, they will only make a parabola and come back to Earth. Therefore, we always need constant acceleration. Now, looking at these two things, if we have a wing on a jetliner, a normal plane, which is moving through the air, and our plane is not able to constantly accelerate, it reaches at all times a velocity. If it reaches a velocity, we are working against a force which is an acceleration, and that plane must come down. One of the problems that we have with rockets as a transport system is that rockets, to continuously accelerate, consume all their fuel in minutes or seconds, and so they are not useful to transport anything. We use jets or propellers to get our object to a velocity, but if we get our object to a velocity and we have a force which is accelerating, we should theoretically churn up all our fuel rather quickly to stay in the air. You may note that jet fighters, when they go into attack mode, chew up all their fuel rather quickly. But when they are in glide and stuff like that, they can go for a very long time. So it's important to understand how a wing creates efficiency in the air to counter a gravitational force, which is an acceleration. Without understanding that, one can't understand how a wing flies. So we understand buoyancy in a hydrostatic atmosphere, that being the Earth's atmosphere, which is contained within a force field with one side only, which is solid. We understand that we must counter that acceleration or force at all times and do it efficiently. How does this wing therefore work? I will show you. Again, this is the work of the NACA. You can look it up on YouTube. It's extensive, hours of videos, all quite boring. Now, our wind comes in like this. Now, I'm going to exaggerate this for effect. As we hit that wind, we create a section like that. In this section here, you can see the lines of air are still flowing smoothly, but are separated, and we create, at the highest camber of the wing, a low pressure area. With the wind hitting the front of the wing, we create a high pressure area. One of the important things about gas laws is that, and we know this just from empirical evidence, if we get a compressor to blow up our tyres, we have a section of air which is under high pressure contained in a cylinder. When we open that cylinder, the air violently accelerates out and also decreases in temperature. The air violently accelerates out from high pressure to low pressure. It does not go at a velocity. It is violent and accelerating. Now, this particle here at the high pressure system, because we have a constant low pressure system caused by either a camber on the wing, which means that the top section is at greater curve than the lower section, or the angle of attack creating that form. You can use a symmetrical wing as well, just not with a camber, using an angle of attack to create this high pressure, low pressure system. This particle at the front will accelerate into the low pressure system over the wing. Here is how this counters gravity. If our wing here is travelling at 1,000 kilometres an hour, let us call it a 737 or 747. I'll keep the maths easy. The acceleration of that particle at its peak point, at the highest camber of the wing or the centre of the angle of attack with a tilted symmetrical wing, will reach approximately 50% faster. It will accelerate actually at that speed to over the speed of sound just over the wing in that front section. This acceleration, which is automatically caused by that airfoil moving through the air, is what counters the acceleration of gravity. That's 9.8 meters per second. From Newtonian physics, what we're pushing down is not a velocity of air, but an incredibly accelerated parcel of air. This low pressure system created is as though we have a balloon sitting on top of the wing, creating buoyancy, not necessarily driving the wing up, but making the entire aircraft appear lighter. What is important with these things is the natural acceleration of air through the shape of the airfoil, not using any force from our fuel, will allow us to counter gravity without using much fuel and making the aircraft efficient. The acceleration of air also adds, if we only had a velocity of air going down, then that wing would not have lift. This is why, this is what lift is, the acceleration of that particle over to this point and down, creating buoyancy with our buoyancy laws in physics and an accelerated classical Newtonian physics. Now, to make a wing function in this method, the most important thing is we must have wing speed, which occurs from wind speed, or if we were on the ground, we must have ground speed by running. We must combine these things. What is important is this: if this wing is stationary on the ground, we all know that plane don't fly. To create this small pressure system around our airfoil, or rather our airfoil creates a pressure system within our gaseous atmosphere creating lift, we need speed. If our wing is stationary on the ground, it's not actually a wing. It has the potential to become a wing, but it is not a wing. So for each wing and a weighting of that wing or substructure beneath it, we need a certain speed to enable this pressure system to be created. If we do not achieve that speed, this pressure system will not be created and this wing will not function. You will drop out of the sky. The most important thing always is to get speed to get to the minimum speed required, taking into account the weight to make the wing function as a wing. On takeoffs, the most common problem is the only problem essentially on all takeoffs is lack of speed. We're assuming first that one has lifted their wing symmetrically straight, because if one doesn't, then one's not really starting the process correctly. It is like each plane that takes off positions itself on a runway into the wind and follows a white line with one vector of takeoff, as it does with one vector of landing into the wind, to allow a decrease in power required to take off, using the wind speed to get enough speed to create this, make this wing function as a wing. One of the most common problems of paragliding is reverse takeoffs. Nobody likes to do a forwards takeoff because they believe they can't see their wing, and they need to see their wing to be able to take off correctly. If one has watched all our students who know absolutely nothing, we have perfect launches all the time, they know nothing and cannot see their wing. As soon as people turn to reverse launches, especially those who are experienced, they can see their wing, they continuously muff their launch. So if we muff our launches generally only on reverse takeoffs because we want to see our wing, because we want to control it and put our intellectual and physical inputs into it, and when we do forward launches, every single forward launch I see is pretty much perfect and people can't see their wing, what do we feel is the common denominator that is causing the problem? When we do a forward launch, we have our hands up and we progressively keep moving forwards, accelerating in one continuous vector because we can see where we are going and we have only one vector we're thinking of. The common problem with the reverse is people lift it up, they have no velocity, they move to their left, they move to their right, they move backwards. The natural way to turn is to take a step backwards. In every instant, we are not giving forwards speed to the wing to create the pressure system around it to make it function as a wing. With the forward launch, no matter where their wing is, because people give it a continuous acceleration in one vector, the wing actually behaves as a wing pretty much every time, again, so long as the wing is lifted symmetrically into the wind. So this is the reason that the most common fault in all launches is lack of speed. The only inputs I give on all launches of maybe 10,000 has been run, 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 which means give the wing more speed, hands up, which means off the brakes to give the wing more speed, That's assumed that the wing is lifted correctly in the first place, because if it's not left correctly, we put it back down and then lift it correctly because we're not directly into the wind, so we don't bother going any further. There is no point.